In this video tutorial, we'll take a look at how to make sushi with geometry nodes in Blender. This video will go over all aspects of this process. For this tutorial, I'll be using Blender 4.1, and we'll start off with a brand new scene. We have our default cube here, and we'll keep that for now, and we'll click on that cube and go to our geometry node tab. On our geometry node tab, we're going to create a new geometry node network. So we'll click new. And now we have our group input and our group output. And right now we're just going to disconnect this and we'll get rid of our cube. We actually don't even need the group input in this case, so I'm just going to delete that. And what we're going to start doing is we're going to create a cylinder to start this off. So I'll press Shift A for our search, and I'm going to type cylinder and create mesh primitives cylinder. Now we have a cylinder if we connect that mesh to our geometry output. So what we'll do now is set up the cylinder to be roughly the size of one of those Maki Sushi rolls. I think for vertices we can do 16, side segments we'll do something like 12, and probably a radius and depth of 1 and 2 is okay for now. That looks like a pretty decent shape. The next thing that we're going to do is start to deform this, because right now this doesn't really look like the wrapped seaweed or nori that would go around the rice. It feels too perfect. So what we're going to end up doing is creating a set position node. So we'll connect this mesh up to a set position node, and this will allow us to change the position of those vertices. So for now, we're not really doing anything, so we don't see any change, but what we're going to do is we're going to offset the vertices. So we'll take the offset. So I'm going to give us a little bit more room here, and I'll take the offset of this set position node, and I'll drag it up to a scale, a vector math scale, and this is going to control our intensity of the offset. So we'll use that scale here to control the intensity. We'll connect this up to another scale, and this scale is going to connect up to a texture. So this scale is going to have a vector, which is the direction it's going to push out in, which will be the normals of our geometry. So we're going to want to connect that vector to a normal. And you can see the whole shape pushes outwards now based on this scale. But instead of controlling it by a value, we're going to control it by a texture. So I'll drag that out and create a Voronoi texture, and we'll connect it into the distance of the Voronoi texture. So something like that. Now that doesn't really look like sushi or like the seaweed for the sushi, but we'll change some of these settings here. So we'll leave it as 3D, but we'll change it from F1 to smooth F1. We'll click on normalize to dampen the effect a little bit. And we'll change our scale to something like 16. Maybe the detail will drag up to maybe 1 is fine. And then roughness is probably okay how it is. And this already looks pretty good. So I think I'll leave it there. And now we kind of have the scale amount, which controls our intensity. And maybe we'll set that to 0.5 for now. So now we have a little bit of breakup on that seaweed that's going to line the outside of the sushi roll. The next thing I want to do is get rid of the top and bottom faces that we currently have here. So we do have a way of selecting those from these two pins here, the top, side, and bottom of our cylinder. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go in here and spread this out a little bit so we have a little bit more room. And I'm going to take the top and I'm going to create a math add node, and we'll take the top and the bottom vertices, and that's what I'm doing here. I'm creating a selection by adding the parts that make up the top and the bottom, and I'm going to delete that. So I'll take this add and I'll connect it to a delete geometry, and it will be our selection. We're selecting the top and the bottom added together to delete. Now we don't want to delete the points, we want to delete the faces. And then we'll connect that up to our geometry, our set position node here, and we'll output that and see what we get. And now we get only the sides without the top and bottom. Next, we need to start filling this sushi roll. So what we're going to do next is leave our geometry, our delete geometry node down here that produces this current result, because we actually want the mesh with the top and the bottom caps on this shape, because we're going to turn it into a volume. So I'm going to take the set position node here, which still has the top and bottom faces, which you can see, and I'm going to drag that out to a mesh to volume, and it will turn this mesh into a volume, where now it becomes pretty much like almost like a cloud or a volume. And we'll leave that at default settings. And I'm going to connect that to a distribute points and volume. And we're going to scatter points into that volume. So if I output that, currently looks like this, a couple points. We're going to change it to a grid formation, and we're going to set up the size here to maybe something like 0.2 for X, Y, and Z, and for threshold, maybe 0.01. And now we have a bunch of points within this shape that we can use. Next, we need to go model a grain of rice to attach to all these points. So I'm just going to quickly go on over to our layout tab, and I'm going to hide this for now. And I'm just going to create a very simple cube like this. And technically we don't really need to do any shaping here, but maybe just for fun, I'm going to go in here to the modifier tab, and we'll need to smooth it out somehow. So I'll do just something really simple, like a subdivision surface. There we go. And maybe add 2 levels of subdivision. And again, we could probably adjust this in our node network, but maybe I'll just scale it up a little bit to make it almost like a grain of rice shape. And I'll name this as well. So maybe I'll name this something like rice grain. And now we have our grain of rice that we can use within our geometry nodes. So I'll hide that for now. I'll go back to our shape here in our geometry nodes. And what we're going to do is now copy that rice grain to all these points. And the way that we're going to do that is connect this distribute points and volume up to a instance on points. And we're going to instance a mesh to all those points. And that mesh that we're going to instance is going to be a object info where we can select a mesh, and we'll select our rice grain. Now they look a little bit too large right now, and that's okay. And I'll turn on this as instance, but I don't think it'll matter too much. And then I should probably smooth these out because they look kind of faceted. So I'll add a set, shade, smooth, and then connect that. And now they'll look a little bit smoother. And now we can adjust some of the scale here of that shape. So maybe X, I'll put 0.2, Y 0.1, and Z 0.1. And now we have all these little rice pieces sized a bit better. Now we need to have them randomly rotate because they're all doing the same thing right now. So what I'm going to do is after this instance on points, I'm going to add a rotate instances. And what we're going to do is rotate the instances based on a random value. So I'm going to create a random value node. And I'll set the type to vector because there's 3 axes, X, Y, and Z. And we can set the min and max, and then we can connect this to our rotation here. And I know the pins are different colors, but this will work. The only thing you have to keep in mind is right now our values for rotation have to be in not degrees, but in radians. So if you want to do like 360 degrees in radians, our max amount for the randomization will be something like 6.28. So I'm just going to set that up for now. We could do a conversion by dividing 180 by pi, or pi divided by 180, and multiply that by this number, which then could be degrees. But to keep it simple, I'm just going to do this. We know we want to randomize them in 360 degrees in X, Y, and Z. And now they have all random rotations. So 360 degrees in radians is 6.28. And we could adjust this as well. Like maybe the y-axis here, I'll leave it at 0. And that just makes sure that our top and bottom of our roll are more flat. And maybe that works a little bit better. So perhaps I'll do that. Or perhaps I'll add a small value so it just rotates just a very slight amount, but still stays mostly flat. Now maybe we want to see everything all put together. So what we're going to do is connect our rotate instances to a join geometry node, and also connect that up to our delete geometry node back here where we deleted the top and bottom caps of that cylinder. So we'll combine those two things with a join geometry node and then output that. And this is what we got. So the only problem is right now our nori or our seaweed is crashing with the rice here. So we need a way of offsetting that or pushing that seaweed outwards to not crash with that rice. To do this, I'm going to go back to our delete geometry node here, and we're going to drag it out to a set position. And very much like we've done already, we're going to apply an offset. So we'll do the same thing. We'll create a scale or vector math scale node, and then we'll connect our vector to the normal of the surface. And now this scale will act as a way of pushing that out. So instead of joining the delete geometry node, I'm going to disconnect this pin by holding Control and left click and just pulling it out. And I will connect up our new set position node. And now we can see that this scale controls our offset. So we can just dial that in so it doesn't crash through much of the rice pieces. So perhaps something like maybe 0.2 or so, 0.21, give it a little bit of extra room. That ensures that none of that rice is crashing through. So this roll feels a little bit thin. Let's add some thickness to it, just a very small amount of thickness. So we're going to take this set position now, and we're going to connect it to a extrude mesh. And we're going to extrude out this shape by a very small amount, maybe something like 0.03. Extrude the faces. Don't have it set to individual, else each face will be separated and push outwards. Like if we just preview this, we don't want that where they're all separating. So we want individual turned off, and they all stay connected now. Then what we're going to do is subdivide this. So subdivision surface. We'll subdivide it just one level, and then we'll do set shade smooth to make it not look faceted. And then we'll output that, and that starts to look a little bit better. So now we have our nori or our seaweed that wraps around the rice. Now if we add this all together, so I go here, join geometry, disconnect the other one, because we don't want that anymore. I want to attach it to our new node here. So we'll connect those both up and output. And now we kind of have this working, but there's this huge gap around the edge of the seaweed. And even the rice doesn't really fill fully to that edge on either side. So how can we solve that? We're going to do a little bit of a cheat here. We're going to do a secondary scatter of points, but we're not going to do new scattering. We're going to reuse what we have, but almost just duplicate it and transform them a little bit. And to do this, it won't be the best way of approaching this, but it'll be an easy way to do this. So what we're going to end up doing is take our set position node that we just extruded with to create this thickness on the seaweed. But instead, we're going to also drag it out. And maybe I'll just collapse this random value node here to give us a little bit more room on our graph. So I'll drag the set position node out and connect it to a geometry proximity node. And we're going to look for faces. And the position is going to go to a multiply that will allow us to add some sort of control. And then what we're going to do is add another set position node. So set position, but not connect into selection. We're going to connect this into the position, not offset this time. And the geometry that we're going to change the position of is going to be our rotated instance of these rice points. So I'll take that, after we've instanced everything, I'll connect that to geometry here. And what that's going to do is duplicate all those rice points and pieces and shift them to fit more near the proximity or edge of this roll. So now if we connect that or add that, we take this new set position node and also join that together. Now what we're going to see, assuming this all updates and we set the offset. So for the multiply here, I'll have to dial in an offset. So maybe I'll just start dragging this up and you could see that, okay, we can start offsetting those rice points, which is pretty cool, like this. So maybe I can dial it in like 0.875 for X, 0.875 for Y, and 1 for Z. And now it fills right to the edge of this seaweed and almost going over it a little bit, which makes it feel a little bit more realistic. So now we have our sushi seaweed with the rice wrapped inside. And maybe at this point, we take a step back and we start cleaning up some of this graph here, because this is getting a little bit confusing to look at. So we'll do some grouping next. So we can definitely go in here and start grouping things to make this cleaner. Like we can go here to our deformation for our cylinder to add those details on the side and to select all these nodes and press Control G, and it will group them into a subgraph or like another graph that we see here that's on its own. And if you right click and go to exit group, we can see that all that stuff has been condensed into one node. So we can do that. In this case, I'm not going to do that because I think it'll be easier for everyone just to see all the nodes. So I'm not kind of hiding things, or like it's easier for you just to see what nodes are connected to what. But this is nicer to do for your own networks. But for now, to keep this simple, I'm not going to group it. So if I did group something and I want to ungroup it, I can right click and just go to ungroup and get my nodes back. So I'm just going to leave them all out like this, but the way of organization that I'm going to do right now to make it easier is just start selecting nodes, pressing Shift A, searching, and creating a layout frame. And that will give me a box that I can drag and drop nodes into, and then click on that box and go over here to this little arrow and go to our node and give that frame a label. Like I can say here, maybe something like details, or whatever we want to call it. And now we have this little details text, so we kind of know what it's doing. Now we can also go in here and change the color, like you even have a color picker. You can do whatever you want to this. I'm going to leave that off for now, but I'll go in here and properly group this stuff. So I'll call this Nori details. It's like our seaweed details. After that, maybe what we'll do is we'll take our cylinder node that we originally had, our set position node, and I'm just going to try to group these just a little bit nicer to look at. I'm not going to do the best here. They're going to be fairly condensed together, but I'm mainly doing that so if you're looking at these networks, you can see all the nodes much easier. So this is the next section that I'm going to do, where we have the cylinder. It applies the Nori details. We delete some of the faces here, and we start scattering the points. So maybe I'll take that section, I'll make a new frame, drag all those nodes into that frame. There we go. And I'll call this something like maybe sushi roll plus scattering points. And now I have that text there. So that's a little bit more organized. Next, I'll go down here and I'll take our normals, our scale, where we do our deleted geometry and we add thickness to that sushi kind of seaweed roll, that nori roll. And what we can do is maybe take all these nodes here. Those are all the ones that deal with that. And I'm going to create another frame. Drag and drop it in. There we go. And give that a name as well. And that will be our offsetting nori plus adding thickness. Okay, so there we go. Now we know what that's doing. So a little bit cleaner now. And then maybe the next thing that we do is instancing our rice to points. So that would be all this stuff here. So again, I'll create another frame, drag and drop that in. There we go. Place that here, give it a label. Label be instancing rice to points. There we go. And it's starting to look a lot better. And then finally, filling the edges of the rice. around the sushi or the nori wrap around the outside. So that's going to be the stuff that's left over here, the geometry proximity, the multiply for the offset, and then the set position. So I'll create another frame, drag those nodes into there, give it a label, filling edges of the roll with rice. There we go. And I'll spread this out a little bit so it's kind of easier to look at. Something like that is okay. And then we have our join geometry node, which adds all of it together. And this feels a little bit more structured. So I'm just going to put that like this so you could see an overall view of it. But now it's a little bit easier to look at our different sections of what's happening. Now it's time to add some filling to this roll. So if we want to add that avocado piece in the center, we got to go make that geometry. So I'm just going to go over to the layout tab, quickly just create a cube, keep this simple, scale it up. There we go. There's my avocado piece. And to make it really easily, we're just going to go in here and edit it, select points, and I'm going to select one side of the points like that, and just scale them inwards like that. Maybe push them back a bit like that. So it's kind of like the shape of some slice of avocado. You could probably model this a bit better, but something like that is going to give us a good starting point. I'll push it back into the center now, maybe scale it up. We don't want to be stingy on that avocado. And then, there we go. And to make that look a little bit more like avocado, maybe we go in here and go to our modifiers, and we should probably name it as well, but we'll add our modifier, which will be a bevel. And that's going to bevel the edges, is to give it a bit of a taper. And for that taper, maybe we'll keep it like 0.2, but a lot of segments. So it's a very soft, smooth fall off. You could probably dial this in better, and then angle, I'll do like 80 degrees. Maybe that's too sharp around those edges. 72. 80, yeah, it's okay. We'll go with that. We'll smooth it anyways. We'll take this and go shade smooth. That doesn't look too bad. It'll work. But you can spend a bit more time, model that in a bit nicer. And the problem right now is if we were to look at this, where that avocado piece is, there's still rice crashing in and scattered with it, which is not a huge problem, but maybe it'd be better if the rice wasn't crashing through it. So I'm going to quickly just add some naming to this. So we're not just leaving that here. I'm going to rename this to avocado Maki 001. Avocado Maki 001. And maybe I'll name the cube too for our sushi roll. Maybe let's call that like Maki 001. Maki roll or something. Naming's better and easier to do now than later when it's a gigantic mess. So now that we have that, I'm going to go back to geometry nodes, go in here, and we're going to add something. We're going to Boolean away this avocado shape from our set position here before we turn it into a volume. So that center piece where the avocado is will be hollowed out from our volume. So what we're going to do is give us a little bit of extra room here. I'm going to shift over some of these node networks. Way easier to move now that they're all in frames. So I'm just going to give us some extra room. And what I'm going to do is put a node in here. I'm going to put in a Boolean node. So I can search Boolean, and we'll connect our set position to mesh 1. And what we're going to do is set mesh 2 to be our geometry that we're going to select. So we'll connect that to our object info. And that object info is going to be our avocado. And then we'll connect the result to our mesh to volume. And that should do it. We want to make sure this is on difference. And if we were to look at this now, it looks kind of the same, but if I go into wireframe, we now see where that avocado is. A lot of that rice has disappeared. And we just want to make sure not too much of it has disappeared. So let's take a look at this piece and just make sure that this is updating correctly. So I'm going to shift it around and I should see this update. And if we're not seeing that update, let's check our geometry node network. I have it set to original. So you want to set this to relative, because if it's original, it's not going to take into consideration custom transforms that we do. Like if I move this, it doesn't change anything. But by setting this to relative, it's going to take the exact position that that avocado piece is at and apply that with the Boolean. Whereas original, it'll discard that information. So if I set it to relative for our object info, great. Bottom looks good. Top looks good. I can even scale this. I don't want it to stick out that far. There we go. That looks pretty good. And if we were to look at wireframe mode, where the avocado piece is, none of the rice is crashing into it. So it's properly in the center of the roll, surrounded by the rice, and then the rice is surrounded by the nori or the seaweed, and we have a little bit more of a proper sushi roll. So now that we have that avocado piece in there, we have our rice, we have everything, maybe it's time to start looking at how we can start shading some of this stuff. Now, before we start shading, we have to make sure we have UVs on these pieces if we want to apply any sort of texture. So for that final step, I'm going to go to the group output node here, and I'm going to press Shift A. I'm going to search for a UV unwrap node, and we'll leave it as angle based, and we'll just connect that up to a blank point here, and it will create a UV input. And then we'll go here to our little sidebar tab. We'll go to group. We'll see our UV here. We'll change the attribute from point to face corners, because for UVs, that will be more proper to be the corners of the faces, not the center of the points. So it's kind of like the proper mapping of our UV space. And then what we're going to end up doing is going to our Maki role here, like our thing that we have this whole geometry node network connected to. And we're going to go to our modifiers and we'll see our geometry node network. And we're going to go to output attributes and we have to set the UV attribute. This is outputting the UVs to something, but we need to attach that connection to a proper name. If you set this to UV, for some reason, I don't think it works properly in Blender. So we're going to call it with a different name. We're going to give it a name that we know is the UVs from our geometry nodes. So maybe we'll call it something like GeoNode UV, like that. And that will store the UVs that we generated here into that attribute name. Next, we'll start doing our shading. So I'm going to go over to the shader editor. I'm going to create a new material. I'll call it something like Nori Seaweed, whatever we want to call it. And I'll look for that default material. There we go. The principled BSDF, that'll work totally fine. And we can start bringing in our textures. And again, if you don't have the textures, because you're not part of the Patreon, you could definitely check out the description and the link to that below and join the Patreon and you'll get these textures as well. Or you could just use color or your own textures. So first we'll connect up the base color. So I'll connect that up to a just a simple image texture. And we'll load in our textures. So I'll click open. I'll load in my seaweed color map. And since it's a targa and it's a colored image, it's going to be sRGB color space in this case. And the vector should go to our UVs. So I'm going to drag this out to a attribute and we're going to choose attribute vector and have to type in the UVs. So GeoNode UV, that name that we're storing our UVs in. Now, if we want to preview this on our surface or apply it to the actual roll on the outside here, I have to go do that through my geometry nodes. So I'll switch back on over to geometry node editor. We're going to go to where we apply the thickness to our seaweed. And at the very end here, after the shade smooth, I'm going to do a set material. And I'll choose that Nori seaweed. And I'll connect that geometry to this join geometry. And then we'll be able to take a look at this in shaded mode here, and we'll see our texture. Now maybe I want to tile that a bit more, so I'll go back to my shader editor. I'll take this attribute and I'll multiply it by some values. And those values will be how many times you're tiling. By default, it's like 1, 1, and 1. The last one doesn't matter because the UVs are in X and Y. But maybe I'll tile it a little bit more. So I'll do 1.25 on X and 1.25 on Y. So that's how I could adjust the tiling through here. So now we have our color texture attached. But there's a lot of other things that we're going to have to do here to get this to look proper. So the next thing I'm going to want to load in is all the other textures. So I'll collapse this, and I'm going to go and create, again, another texture image. This time, we're going to connect this one for the roughness or glossiness. Roughness is just the inverted glossiness. I've called it glossiness, but it actually works okay just plugging it in directly. So right now it's obviously too shiny, but I'll load in my texture. So I'll click open, and then I'm going to select my texture, my gloss, throw it in here. It looks odd because we need to connect up the UVs, so connect the vector to my multiply here. And then it still looks odd because the color space is sRGB. For gloss, it's not really a color, it's a value determining how glossy or how rough the surface is. So it should be non-color. And that's going to give us a more proper look of it. And that feels a little bit better. I know it feels overly shiny right now, but I'm going to be adding a normal as well. So that'll be the next thing that we do. I'll collapse this now, and I'm going to go in here and add another texture image, connect this to the normal. But before we do that, we actually have to connect it to a normal map node and then connect it to our normal. And it shouldn't go into strength. The color should go into the colors. Strength will be like a multiplier. So I click on open, and then I go and load my normal map. Again, color space should be non-color because of the data determining parts that are faking the angle of how light interacts with the surface. And then we need to connect the vector up to our multiply here to get the proper UVs. And there we go. Now we see that normal map, and maybe that's a bit too strong. So we could adjust this 0.5. Maybe that's better. But I'll leave it at 1. We'll see how that looks when it actually renders. It might actually be okay. It is pretty rough for sushi seaweed, for nori. And then finally, I'm going to have to add another texture as well. I'm going to add a image texture for my specular. So for specular IOR level, that's the brightness of this reflection. I'm going to connect that up to a color as well. And I will load in that texture. So I'll click on open and then load in my specular map. For this, I can also set it to non-color, and vector goes to vector. Collapse that. And now we have something that feels a little bit more seaweed, but we're not done yet because seaweed doesn't really just have a surface that's solid. If you put light behind it, the light will shine through. It has a little bit of scattering and a little bit of transmission. So we're going to go in here to our subsurface, and I'll set it to random walk. I'll do like 0.3 for the weight, 1, 1, and 1 for the radius. And scale, you'll probably have to adjust this. We're not modeling the sushi roll to scale right now. So maybe I'll set 1 meter because the sushi roll is like 2 meters tall or something. But you can dial that in based on what you think looks good. And then transmission, I'll go down here and I'll set it to something fairly small, but something maybe like 0.1 or 0.2. So if we were to test render this, we'd be able to see a little bit of the the light or a little bit of transparency through this seaweed, and then we'll see the rice slightly behind it. So if we want to test that out, I'm just going to go here to the render settings, change it to cycles, click on the render here. Maybe we need some light. So I'm going to go in here and just add a light spotlight for now. And I'll move that spotlight maybe from an angle from the side like that and give it a pretty strong intensity, 5,000 watts or something. And then let's take a look at this. And as we change that transmission, like 0.8, it becomes more see-through when we see the rice behind it. I think 0.1 is subtle, but I think that works okay for doing that. So I'm going to stick with that. Next, we'll start shading the sticky rice. So what we're going to do is go in here and create another material. So I'm just going to click on a plus here. And we got our new material, and I'm going to call it sticky rice. And we can start dialing that in. So for the rice, it's going to be fairly easy. You could probably change the color. I left it as kind of the default white almost. But it'd probably be a bit more realistic if you dial it in a bit better. But for subsurface, I'm going to go in here and change it to Christensen Burley, which gives us a pretty quick rendering subsurface scattering, and it works pretty well for this. So I'm going to put its weight to 1. It's like going to be full scattering light into it. Radius 1, 1, and 1. And scale, you might have to adjust this, but I'll start it off with 1.5 meters because, again, our sushi roll is not modeled properly to scale. Right now it's like 2 meters tall and whatever. So if we change the scale, we're going to have to adjust this. But for now, I'll do this. And then for the transmission, we want light to go into that rice a little bit, or have it a little bit kind of almost transparent in a way, or refractive to some extent, or transmit a little bit of light. So I'll set this to 0.2. But again, you can change these to whatever you think looks good. And I'm going to add a little bit of a sheen to it as well. Maybe that's something we can do with our sushi roll as well. If I go back, I'm just going to hop on over to our nori. A sheen can help add a little bit of extra shininess to it. And sometimes that can help with certain materials. So maybe for our sushi roll or nori, our seaweed part of it, I'll put that sheen to 0.25. And roughness, that's how, if it's very soft or is it very sharp, I'll set it to maybe 0.2. And that just really helps it feel more detailed and have a little bit more shading to it. And same thing we're going to do with our sticky rice. The sheen, I'm going to go in here and set it to something like maybe weight 1 for the rice. And I'll put the roughness to something like 0.175. And we don't see this affecting it right now because we should apply this to our rice. So maybe let's do that next. So I'm going to jump back over to geometry nodes, find our rice. Now there's 2 of them. There's the edges with the rice, and then there's the center part of the rice. So we have to do that to both of them. And I'm just going to go here and just add a set material node, or just copy one of these set material nodes, paste it, connect it, paste another one, connect it, and connect those both up to join geometry after I've actually added in the proper material. So I'll put these into the frames where they belong, and they're both should be set to sticky rice, connect, and now they're applied. So now we can go back to our shader editor, to our sticky rice, and you see how that rice looks even in our shaded mode here. And if we go to the rendering mode, well, there it is. So it looks a little bit odd. And this has to do with how we're instancing. So when you have them all instanced like this, it treats each one of these as like a separate almost object. But if you were to realize the instances, there's a node called realize instances. They'll take all those instances and pretty much combine them as one mesh. And if you do that, it will affect the shading for something with subsurface. And in this case, it's going to benefit if we realize those rice instances, because it will shade and scatter light through them as if they're one solid block, where the two rice pieces collide with each other or kind of crash through each other. You'll treat it as one whole piece instead of separate pieces, and it'll scatter the light differently. And that's kind of what happens in real life, where maybe some of that rice gets pressed together and mushed together. So we probably want to do that. So right now, if we look at this rice with the render, take note of how it's shading. You get a lot of shadows, bright highlights. But if we go now and we go to our geometry node editor, and before we set our material, we're going to add a realize instances node. And I'll remove the instancing from it, pretty much make it one combined geo, so it's not the most efficient. But doing that, copy that, and do it again down here. But by doing that, it's going to change the way it shades and look much better. So now, if I go back to our shader editor, and we go back to our rendering mode here, look how it shades now. It feels much more kind of being lit and scattering light altogether, especially farther away. If we look at that with our light here, that starts to feel a little bit more like what we'd expect. Maybe our lighting's a bit too bright right now, so we can go adjust that. Maybe we'll go to our world settings here, set the background color a little bit brighter to have more overall light scattering. And then maybe the spotlight, I'll go and bring down its wattage to 1,000 watts or something. And maybe even just offset it, like light at more of an angle. Like that. Maybe even adjust some other properties of it. But already by doing that, if we give this some time, it's starting to look a little bit more like a sushi roll. Now, last thing that we're going to do here for the shading is our avocado. So we got our avocado in the center here. We need to shade that as well. So we're just going to click on that avocado, add a new material, and I'm going to call that, we'll give it a name. So maybe I'll just call it like avocado. And for the principled BSDF, we don't have a texture for this one. We're going to shade it procedurally. So again, I'm going to do some subsurface on it. Weight, maybe 0.3, 1, 1, and 1. Amount, maybe 2 meters. Again, it's not proper real world scale, but that's okay. Sheen, let's add some sheen to it because it might be a little bit kind of not totally dry. So maybe 1, and roughness maybe 0.1. We can also use coat. Coat kind of maybe works a bit better for when things need wetness. Sheen is a little bit different. But you could adjust these. I'm just dialing this in. We could probably go with coat for this, but I'll try this as well, since we've stuck with that for a lot of these other pieces. So feel free to adjust this. But for the color, I'm going to drag this out to a color ramp. And we're going to use a ramp to colorize this piece. And we have a start point here and an end point. But right now, it just kind of fades the color of the whole thing. So what we're going to do is connect the factor to a gradient texture, and that will apply this color ramp to a gradient on the surface. So now I get something like this. And I'm just going to dial in some colors here. So I can probably just eyeball it, but I'll click on this here and choose like a green. It's kind of like an avocado green. I'm just thinking, what color would I choose if I was the avocado? Something like that. And then I'll add another point. Choose another avocado green. Maybe you have a better idea of what avocado green is instead of what I'm dialing in here, but let's go with that. And then it kind of tapers off to something like a little bit of a tinted yellow almost. So maybe something like that. Yes, it's starting to feel like avocado. And then at the very end, maybe it goes a little bit brighter. I don't know. Subtle, but it's there. So there's our avocado piece shaded. And now that we have that, I could dial this in, make it further, more tighter there, but I think this works pretty well. And what we can do now is render this. So maybe I'll just go back like this, and I'll just click on the render tab. Okay, that's not too bad. Maybe we dial this in a bit more. That's too sharp. You have to go in here and make that green a bit brighter. So you can kind of play around with this and dial into what you think looks like an avocado piece, but I don't think this is too bad. So maybe I have a starting point there. Now to make this feel a little bit more like avocado, maybe what I'll do is I'll add some bump. So I'll take the normal, connect it to a bump, and I'll use a texture, just like a noise texture. So I'll connect the height to a noise texture factor. And maybe I'll set it to something. Probably want to preview this. Let's take a look at this noise. So maybe I'll change the scale. -3. What about detail? What does that do? Okay, detail's good. Let's do like 12. Roughness, I think 0.5 is okay. So I'm just dialing through here. I think this is all right. Let's try that. And then strength, maybe this is a bit too much. So maybe something like 0.2, just very subtle. You'll add some slight shading break up to it. And let's give that a try. So now if I zoom out, click on render, yeah, it adds a little bit of shading to it that makes it just feel a little bit more believable, a little bit more like an uneven surface from the avocado being cut or scooped out or whatever. And if you want access to this full scene that I showed at the beginning of this video with all these different rolls, where I have ones with the cucumber slices here, and I have one with the tamago or the egg, you can get access to this, which produces, a render like this whole blend file. You can get access to this whole blend file if you're part of the Patreon, which there's a link to down in the description below. So if you're part of the Patreon, you'll get access to this blend file, as well as the PDF for this video, which goes over all the steps we went over in this video in a little bit more detail. So make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and let me know what other things you'd like to know how to do in Blender.